The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Sarah's pale face as she sat clutching the pregnancy test results. Her hands trembled not from the cool air conditioning, but from the devastating conversation that had just shattered her world. Marcus, the man she'd planned to marry, the father of her unborn child, had looked at her with cold, distant eyes just minutes before. "I can't do this, Sarah. I'm not ready to be a father," he'd said, his voice devoid of the warmth she'd grown to love over their 3 years together. The words had hit her like physical blows, each syllable carving away pieces of her heart. She'd watched helplessly as he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor, growing fainter with each step until silence consumed her. Now she sat alone on the uncomfortable plastic chair in the obstetrics waiting room, surrounded by happy couples discussing baby names and nursery colors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was in a place meant for celebration, yet she'd never felt more isolated. The test results in her lap confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. She was 8 weeks pregnant, and now she was utterly, completely alone. The reality of her situation began to sink in like ice water through her veins. No partner, a modest income as a graphic designer, and now a baby on the way. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over, but the weight of abandonment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden she couldn't shake. Sarah's composure finally cracked as the full weight of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. The tears she'd been holding back began to fall freely, each drop carrying the pain of betrayal and the fear of an uncertain future. Other patients in the waiting room glanced her way with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, unsure whether to offer help or preserve her privacy. She fumbled for her phone, scrolling through her contacts with blurry vision. Her mother lived 3 states away, battling her own health issues. Her sister was deployed overseas with the military. The friends she might have called seemed suddenly distant, their lives filled with their own dramas and responsibilities. The phone felt heavy in her hands as the reality set in. She truly had no one to call, no shoulder to lean on in this moment of crisis. A nurse with kind eyes approached her cautiously. "Honey, are you all right? Do you need someone to call?" she asked gently, her voice cutting through Sarah's internal spiral. Sarah looked up, mascara streaking down her cheeks, and shook her head. The words, "There's no one to call," stuck in her throat like shards of glass. The nurse's expression softened with understanding. She'd seen this before. Women abandoned at their most vulnerable moments, left to face life-changing news alone. "Would you like to speak with a counselor? We have someone on staff who specializes in situations like this," she offered. Sarah nodded weakly, grateful for any lifeline in the storm that had become her life. At least someone cared enough to offer help, even if they were paid to do so. As Sarah waited for the counselor, a commotion near the hospital's main entrance caught her attention. Through the large glass windows, she could see a small convoy of black vehicles pulling up to the valet stand. Hospital security guards straightened their postures, and staff members began whispering among themselves. Someone important was arriving. A tall man emerged from the lead vehicle, his presence commanding attention even from a distance. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and even through the glass, she could see the confidence in his stride. He moved with the purposeful grace of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Hospital administrators rushed to greet him, their body language deferential and eager to please. Sarah watched this display of wealth and power with detached curiosity, temporarily distracted from her own crisis. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, devastatingly handsome in the way that only came with excellent genetics and unlimited resources for self-care. As the entourage moved through the hospital lobby, Sarah caught glimpses of the man's face. There was something in his expression that contradicted his obvious wealth and status, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of worry, perhaps even fear. Despite the army of assistants and security personnel surrounding him, he looked somehow solitary, as if his money and power couldn't shield him from whatever had brought him to this place. Sarah found herself wondering what kind of crisis could touch someone who seemed to have everything, and why his obvious distress felt strangely familiar to her own pain. Through snippets of conversation from passing hospital staff, Sarah learned that the mysterious man was Alexander Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore pharmaceutical empire and one of the youngest billionaires in the country. He was here because his mother had been rushed to the ICU following a massive heart attack. Despite all his wealth and influence, he was just another frightened son, hoping for good news about someone he loved. The counselor finally arrived, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Chen. As they spoke in a small private room, Sarah found herself glancing toward the window, wondering about the billionaire who was probably experiencing his own version of feeling powerless in this sterile medical environment. Doctor Chen was patient and understanding, helping Sarah work through her immediate concerns about the pregnancy and her lack of support system. They discussed resources available for single mothers, financial assistance programs, and the importance of prenatal care. The conversation was clinical yet compassionate, giving Sarah something she desperately needed: hope that she could handle this situation, even alone. As their session concluded, Dr. Chen handed Sarah several pamphlets and appointment cards. Remember, Sarah, being alone doesn't mean being without worth or strength. Sometimes our most challenging moments reveal resources within ourselves we never knew existed, she said, squeezing Sarah's hand gently. The words provided some comfort, but as Sarah prepared to leave the hospital, the weight of facing her future alone still pressed heavily on her heart. She had no idea that her path was about to intersect with someone else's moment of desperate need. As Sarah made her way toward the hospital exit, clutching her appointment cards and informational pamphlets, she heard rapid footsteps echoing down the corridor behind her. She turned to see Alexander Whitmore striding toward the elevator bank, his face ashen and his usual composed demeanor completely shattered. Whatever news he'd received about his mother had clearly devastated him. In his haste, Alexander didn't notice the small puddle of water that had been left by a maintenance worker's mop bucket. His expensive Italian leather shoes lost their grip on the wet tile, and he stumbled forward, his phone and several important-looking documents scattering across the floor. Sarah, despite her own emotional state, instinctively rushed to help, kneeling to gather the scattered papers. "Are you all right?" she asked, looking up at him with genuine concern. For a moment their eyes met, and Sarah saw something that shocked her. This powerful, wealthy man looked every bit as lost and frightened as she felt. The vulnerability in his expression was raw and unguarded, nothing like the confident facade he'd worn when entering the hospital. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, as if surprised that anyone would stop to help him. Most people either wanted something from him or were too intimidated to approach. But this young woman, with tear-stained cheeks and concerned eyes, had simply seen another human being who needed assistance. Yes, thank you," he managed, his usual commanding voice reduced to barely more than a whisper. As Sarah handed him his scattered belongings, their fingers brushed briefly, and both felt an unexpected jolt of connection in that moment of shared human fragility. Instead of rushing away as Sarah expected, Alexander remained standing there, studying her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. She could feel his gaze taking in her red-rimmed eyes and the crumpled tissues clutched in her hand. For reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't feel judged by his scrutiny. Instead, she sensed a kindred recognition of pain. "You've been crying," he observed, his voice gentler now than the commanding tone she'd heard him use with the hospital staff. It wasn't a question, but a statement filled with unexpected empathy. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. The last thing she wanted was to break down again in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. Alexander surprised her by sitting down on the nearby bench, patting the space beside him in invitation. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself accepting, drawn by something in his manner that suggested he understood the particular kind of loneliness that could exist even in a crowded place. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people from completely different worlds, united by the universal experience of feeling lost and alone. "My mother is dying," Alexander finally said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "The doctors say she has maybe hours, not days. All my money, all my connections, all the specialists I've flown in from around the world, none of it matters now." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, revealing the frightened sun beneath the billionaire exterior. Sarah felt her heart ache for him, recognizing the helplessness that transcended wealth and status. Sarah turned to face Alexander more fully, her own troubles momentarily forgotten in the face of his obvious anguish. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and he could hear in her voice that she truly meant it. There was no false sympathy or uncomfortable platitudes, just genuine compassion from someone who understood what it felt like when life delivered devastating blows. "What about you?" Alexander asked softly. "What brings you here, looking like your world has ended?" The question was asked with such gentle concern that Sarah found herself wanting to answer honestly. Something about this moment, sitting beside a grieving stranger in a hospital corridor, made pretense seem pointless. "I found out I'm pregnant today," she began, her voice barely audible. "The father, he left when I told him. Just walked away like our 3 years together meant nothing." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, along with fresh tears that she wiped away quickly with the back of her hand. She expected judgment or awkward discomfort, but Alexander's expression remained understanding and patient. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and she could tell he meant it just as sincerely as she had. That must be terrifying, facing something that big alone. His words weren't patronizing or filled with false optimism, just an acknowledgement of her fear that somehow made it feel more manageable. They sat together in their shared pain, two strangers who had found an unexpected moment of human connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. Neither realized that this brief encounter was about to change both of their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Alexander's phone buzzed urgently, breaking the peaceful moment they'd shared. His face went pale as he read the message, and Sarah could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the device. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. They're saying it's time." Sarah watched as he stood up, his composure cracking visibly under the weight of impending loss. She could see him struggling to maintain the strong facade that had probably served him well in boardrooms and business negotiations. But grief and fear weren't opponents that could be defeated with money or power. He looked utterly alone, despite the team of assistants and security personnel waiting for him down the hallway. "Wait!" Sarah called out, surprising herself with her boldness. Alexander turned back to her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and desperation. Would you like someone to sit with you? I know we don't know each other, but sometimes having another person there, even a stranger, can make the hardest moments a little more bearable." Diesel. The offer hung in the air between them, and Sarah immediately second-guessed herself. Why would a billionaire want comfort from someone like her? She was probably overstepping boundaries she didn't even understand. But something in Alexander's expression told her that her instinct had been right. Beneath all the wealth and power, He was just a frightened son who didn't want to face the worst moment of his life alone. "You would do that?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "You don't even know me." Sarah stood up, smoothing down her simple dress that probably cost less than his tie, and nodded. "Sometimes strangers are exactly what we need," she replied softly. Alexander led Sarah through corridors she'd never seen before, past VIP suites and private wings that regular patients never accessed. The ICU where his mother lay was state-of-the-art, with equipment that hummed and beeped softly in the background. But despite all the advanced technology and round-the-clock care, the scene was heartbreakingly human. An elderly woman lying motionless, surrounded by machines that were keeping her tethered to life. Eleanor Whitmore had been a formidable woman in her prime, Alexander explained quietly as they approached her bedside. She'd built the pharmaceutical empire alongside his father, breaking barriers in a male-dominated industry while raising Alexander to understand that wealth came with responsibility. Even unconscious, there was something regal about her presence, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her face peaceful despite the circumstances. Sarah hung back respectfully, feeling like an intruder in this intimate family moment. But Alexander reached for her hand, his grip desperate and grateful. "Please," he whispered, "don't leave me alone with this." The vulnerability in his voice broke Sarah's heart, and she squeezed his hand in return, offering what comfort she could to this man who had everything except what he needed most in this moment. They sat in vigil together, Sarah quietly observing as Alexander spoke to his unconscious mother, telling her about business deals she'd been excited about, reminding her of shared memories, and finally, with tears streaming down his face, giving her permission to let go. The machines continued their electronic symphony, but Sarah could sense the shift in the room, a letting go that transcended medical equipment and hospital protocols. She found herself crying too, moved by the profound love between mother and son, and honored to witness such an intimate goodbye. Eleanor Whitmore passed away just as the sun was setting outside the hospital windows, casting long golden rays across her peaceful face. The monitors fell silent after the medical team disconnected them, and suddenly the room felt both empty and sacred. Alexander sat motionless for several minutes, still holding his mother's hand, trying to process the reality that she was truly gone. Sarah remained beside him, not speaking but simply being present as he navigated the first moments of grief. She'd never experienced a loss this profound, but she understood instinctively that sometimes the greatest gift was simply staying when everyone else might leave. Hospital staff moved quietly around them, handling the necessary procedures with professional compassion while giving Alexander space to say his final goodbyes. "She would have liked you," Alexander said suddenly, his voice hoarse from crying. "She always said the measure of a person wasn't in what they had, but in what they were willing to give to others." He looked at Sarah with eyes that were red-rimmed, but somehow clearer than they'd been all day. "You gave me something precious today. You made sure I wasn't alone." The next hours passed in a blur of funeral home representatives, lawyers, and the endless logistics of death. Through it all, Sarah stayed, helping Alexander navigate decisions he was too emotionally drained to make clearly. She fielded phone calls from business associates, arranged for meals he was too grief-stricken to eat, and simply sat with him during the quiet moments when the reality of his loss would hit him anew. She'd never imagined that her worst day could become so meaningful to someone else, or that helping another person through their pain could provide such profound comfort for her own struggles. 3 days later, Sarah received a call that surprised her. Alexander's assistant requested her presence at his downtown office, and despite her hesitation about entering his world, something compelled her to accept. The Whitmore Industries building was everything she'd expected: gleaming marble, expensive art, and the kind of understated luxury that spoke of old money and established power. Alexander's office occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. But when Sarah was escorted in, she found him standing at those windows, looking smaller and more vulnerable than his surroundings suggested. He'd clearly been struggling since his mother's death, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled, his confident bearing replaced by the weight of fresh grief. "I've been thinking about what you did for me," he said without preamble, turning to face her. "You had every reason to focus on your own problems, but instead you chose to help a stranger through the worst day of his life. That kind of compassion is rare, Sarah, especially in my world." His voice carried a sincerity that made her heart skip, and she could see he was building towards something important. "I have a proposition for you," Alexander continued, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I know you're facing an uncertain future as a single mother. I know you're worried about finances, about raising a child alone, about all the challenges ahead." He paused, seeming to gather his courage for what came next. "Let me help you. Not as charity, but as partnership. Marry me, Sarah. Let me be there for you and your child, the way you were there for me when I needed someone most." Sarah stared at Alexander in stunned silence, certain she'd misheard his proposal. Marriage to a billionaire she'd known for only 3 days. The logical part of her brain catalogued all the reasons this was insane. They barely knew each other. They came from completely different worlds, and marriage based on gratitude rather than love was a recipe for disaster. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. This wasn't the impulsive gesture of a grieving man or the calculated move of a businessman. There was genuine caring in his expression, along with a loneliness that matched her own. "I'm not talking about a fairy tale romance," Alexander clarified, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm talking about two people who understand what it means to face life's challenges alone, choosing not to do that anymore." "You don't know me," Sarah protested weakly, though she could feel her resolve wavering. "I'm not sophisticated or educated or any of the things someone in your position should want in a wife." Alexander smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since they'd met. "You're kind, Sarah. You're compassionate and strong and real. In my world, those qualities are far rarer than sophistication or education." He outlined his proposal with the same careful attention to detail he probably brought to business negotiations. She and the baby would want for nothing: the best healthcare, education, opportunities. But more than that, they would have security, stability, and someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. "I can't promise love," he said honestly, "but I can promise respect, partnership, and commitment. Sometimes that's a stronger foundation than passion." As Sarah considered his words, she realized that after a lifetime of relationships based on emotion that ultimately disappointed her, perhaps a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine caring might be exactly what she needed. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the private chapel of the Whitmore estate, wearing a simple but elegant ivory dress that had belonged to Alexander's mother. It wasn't the wedding she'd once dreamed of, but as she looked at Alexander waiting at the altar with genuine warmth in his eyes, she felt a peace she hadn't expected. They were two wounded souls choosing to heal together rather than apart. The ceremony was small, just a few close friends, Alexander's business partner who served as best man, and Dr. Chen from the hospital, whom Sarah had asked to stand with her. As they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, Sarah was struck by the sincerity in Alexander's voice when he promised to cherish and protect both her and the child she carried. These weren't empty words spoken for show. They were commitments from a man who understood the value of loyalty and partnership. Their first months together were an adjustment period filled with patience and discovery. Alexander proved to be surprisingly gentle and considerate, going out of his way to make Sarah comfortable in his world while respecting her independence. When morning sickness struck, he held her hair back and brought her ginger tea. When she worried about prenatal appointments, he cleared his schedule to accompany her. Slowly, carefully, they built something neither had expected: genuine friendship and growing affection. 6 months after their wedding, as Sarah felt their daughter's first kicks and watched Alexander's face light up with wonder when he felt the baby move, she realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories don't begin with passion, but with two people choosing to stay when staying is difficult. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, but it was becoming something beautiful, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the simple but profound decision to face life's challenges together rather than alone. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We hope Sarah and Alexander's journey touched your heart and reminded you that sometimes the most beautiful connections come from the most unexpected moments. Love and kindness can bloom in the darkest times, and sometimes a stranger's compassion can change everything. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. We love hearing from our international audience and learning about the different places our stories reach. Your support means everything to us, and we're grateful you chose to spend this time with us today.